My software here. All right, everybody, welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. I hope everybody's enjoying their Thanksgiving week. Joined by a special guest today, Kym Robinson. He's a writer at the Libertarian Institute and has a really great piece out this week titled The Australian Special Forces Culture of Death. And it goes into this war crimes report put out by the Australian government, which is just a very interesting thing because I can't imagine something like that, like an investigation like that coming out here. And in fact, as I saw this progress, I really didn't. I was just so pessimistic about that this report actually coming out. I really wanted to spend an episode talking about it. So thanks for joining the show, Kym. How's it going? And I guess I'll also mention that you're in Australia. So, you probably have a little bit more insight and everything on this, but tell us a little bit about this war crimes report.
It's good to be here, and thank you very much for having me. Yeah, it's an interesting report because it started 4 years ago, and it occurred because there was I think there was rumors going around regarding the incidents that have now been announced. And the impressive thing is that the Australian government is taking it quite seriously. But that was also after last year in 2019, where Australian journalists and even one of the people involved in the leaking of the documents, the Major David McBride, they were arrested and they were facing prosecution by the Australian Federal Police. And then, because of the momentum with some of the other whistleblowers like Braden Chapman and the documentary that Mark Willesee made called The Killing Fields, I think it was on Four Corners, which is an ABC television show. And then also Kevin Frost, who was another of the whistleblowers who's now deceased. He was a commando, which is similar to the Special Air Service, but they have a different function, but they're special forces all the same. And now that the momentum's built up, the Australian government has to take it seriously. And it's impressive because, like you said, in the United States, this probably wouldn't happen. It just wouldn't. The government would just. President Trump's is pardoning a special forces operator whose own teammates have dobbed him in for doing horrible things. Whereas here, they're definitely taking it seriously, and it's also refreshing that the state-run media, which is our ABC, is pretty much, I would say, the front runner when it comes to a lot of these revelations. So it shows that there's a little bit of a change in the cultural zeitgeist when it comes to war crimes and the reporting. Now, how deep this iceberg goes, we don't know. But what we do know is that 19 soldiers are facing prosecution, and that there were apparently, I think it was 23 incidents of alleged unlawful killings, which basically means prisoners were killed and civilians were murdered. And so there's 39 innocents that were killed in that incident by 25 personnel. Now, I don't know what happened to the other six, why they're not facing prosecution, but I think this inquiry is still going on. And at the moment, there's about 5,000 pages when I last read about it that's there. So, I mean, there's going to be a lot of people, a lot of legal scholars, and a lot of interested parties that will be going through it. So that's kind of what I know. I mean, also, I think it goes back to 2007 to 2013 Australian operations in Afghanistan. But if I recall correctly, the 2017 leak, which is we call the Afghan files here, not to be confused by the Afghanistan papers, but the Afghan files, and that's where the journalists were arrested. That was more current incident. So it shows that there's other things that are occurring after the 2013 stuff as well. So hopefully that brings the viewers slash listeners up to date with what we kind of know.
Yeah, and I'm also going to link to interview that Scott did with, I think it was the journalist, not any of the whistleblowers. That Scott
Mark
Horton.
Wilson,
Yeah,
yeah,
uh,
that was a good interview.
just for people who like have no idea of any of the background and want like a lot more in depth, because we are talking about serious accusations here. We're talking about 39 people being murdered, several more
Yeah.
wounded, and then now you're going to apparently put people on trial. Do you know? I'm not. I have no idea what the Australian legal system is like. If they'll be tried in like a civilian court versus a military court. As you point out, the Afghanistan files that WikiLeaks released, and That was released by Chelsea Manning, who was, then a private in the U.S. Army, and she was tried actually through a military court martial and sentenced to 35 years, rather than like going through the civilian court system.
Well, I think because the Australian Federal Police are involved, that it will probably be, and the Governor General's involved, that it's probably going to be a civilian prosecution. I don't know how severe it's going to be. It's not going to go to the International Tribunal of War Crimes or anything like that. But I think this is all ongoing, so it's very hard. And this is not a new thing, though. Like this is the thing that's curious about it, because I think back in 2001, if I recall, there was a lot of allegations regarding Australian special forces and Australian soldiers killing prisoners and civilians in the Vietnam War, and some of those allegations were raised against special forces, because we also had an SAS regiment or SAS soldiers involved in that war as well. And there was one where there was a Vietnamese prisoner of war whose headless corpse was dragged around at the back of an APC. There was incidences of Australian soldiers opening fire on civilians. And famously, there's a battle in Australian history known as Nui Dat, and in 1966, where a small amount of Australian soldiers held back an attack against a very large force of North Vietnamese army soldiers and Viet Cong. And it's pretty celebrated here in Australia as an incident of Australian military discipline, Australian courage, and Australian tactical clout. And I think in Vietnam, it's remembered a little bit differently. But there was a cover up regarding the death of bamboo pickers. There's a heap of civilians that were picking bamboo, and I can't recall how many of them, but they were killed in the incident. And then Australian officers had ordered the soldiers to use captured weapons and put them on the bodies so that they would be considered enemy combatives, and that would include a KIA count for they were not civilians. And the crazy thing is that there were women and children that were involved in this shooting, because obviously the families would go out and pick the bamboo. And this was one of those things that the Australian government was aware of, and it's only now, with a lot of unredacted freedom of information and also whistleblowers that have come back out 30, 40 years after the fact. All that sort of stuff that the Australian Federal Police was looking at investigating, I think, back in the 2010s, early 2010s, 2012, 2013. But I don't know what's happened with that. It's just been, forgotten almost by the public, and probably by the bureaucracy that is Australian government. And even in the book, The Pity of War by Neil Ferguson, he talks about how Australian and Scottish soldiers were very eager war fighters in the First World War. And what defined that eagerness was the fact that they were willing to kill prisoners of war well after contact. And then, of course, there's an Australian national hero known as Breaker Morant. We have a movie that was made about him in 1980. And there was a famous trial by the British government because they were trying to negotiate a peace treaty with the Boers, the Afrikaans and the Boers. And they then switched the ruling that, well, not the ruling, the orders that Australian soldiers and British soldiers were allowed to kill enemy combatants after they'd been captured, because they were considered insurgents and guerrillas. And somewhere in the mix, the Australian soldiers were unaware that the laws and the rules had changed, so they were used as scapegoats. So the point of the movie is that these Australian soldiers were scapegoats, but it doesn't change the fact that they actually executed Boer civilians and prisoners, and that they had committed what would be defined as war crimes. But what makes that whole incident a celebrated fact in Australian history is that the British had left those soldiers out to dry. So we have a history in Australia. We have a proud military history. There's no doubt about that. We have a lot of heroics, and Australians are extremely eager war fighters. Like there's only probably been one incident in history where Australia's had to defend its homeland. The rest it's been fighting on behalf of the British and the American Empire. There's no dispute about the heroism and the abilities that the Australian military has as war fighters, but this is not a new thing. At the moment, the media here and I think the political powers that be are trying to claim that it's toxic culture that has recently appeared in the Australian military culture. I don't necessarily think that that's true, given the body of the history. But I'm not a special forces operator conducting operations in Afghanistan at the moment. And, I think each contact and each conflict is a segment of its own totality. So I think that to look at history and to have an academic perspective and say, this is the Australian character, would be unfair. But at the same time, war does bring out the very worst in human beings, and wars like the Boer War in the 1900s against the Afrikaans and the Boers, or the war in Afghanistan, there's no clear military objectives. What is the objectives for the Australian military over there? We're told that it's to raise hearts and minds to help reconstruct the country. How do you reconstruct a country that's in the middle of a war? How do you rebuild schools and help people establish nationhood while a war is going on for 20 years? While you have in 2014 in the Doctors Without Borders hospital, where the US military had a gunship circle above and destroy the facility, killing medical practitioners, innocent civilians, and yeah, probably Taliban insurgents too. How do you nation build with that? I don't think you can. And I think a lot of Australian soldiers realize that. And that probably helps the culture of apathy, and definitely would foment a very violent mentality, because it becomes them versus us. It doesn't matter where you are on this planet. It doesn't matter if you're a Japanese soldier pillaging and destroying China in the 1930s, you're an American soldier in Vietnam, which leads to incidents like My Lai, or you're an Australian soldier in Afghanistan, in the middle of Central Asia, thousands of kilometers away from this island continent that is Australia. Like it is what war is. And we know this is not just unique to Australians. New Zealand has had similar allegations raised against its special forces. And as you know, and you've covered on your show numerous times, so has the US military, not to
Yeah.
mention the British and other NATO partners. So it is war. And this is what happens when you have people going overseas and doing these horrible things. And I would even like to say, when it comes to earlier this year with the whole Black Lives Matter movement and police violence, the defund the police movement, you could argue, and a lot of people have argued, that a lot of the police officers are occupying forces in a lot of these jurisdictions and a lot of these suburbs, because they're conducting themselves as a military that's treating these people in a very horrible way. Now, that doesn't mean that not all cops are responsible for these actions, but at the same time, there would have to be a mindset of them versus us. You know, the war on drugs, the war against this, the war on that. It's the language, and it's the training, and it's the mentality, and what kind of individual is ultimately drawn to that lifestyle, to break down someone's house at 3 a.m. because they may be ingesting something that makes them feel better, or makes them sleep better, or makes them forget the pain of their traumas or their own physical ailments, and then to go in all guns blazing, executing their dogs, killing them because if they want to, stand their ground and fight back. Is that not a military operation? Just because it's happening within your own domestic borders does not mean that that's any different to what's happening in Afghanistan. And it's basically them versus us, in the sense of the individual versus the state. And it is the culture. If you want to talk about toxic culture, it is the toxic culture of that. That's what I personally think about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you hit on a lot there. I want to cycle back to something that you
Yep.
point to, that this was an offensive war, especially for Australia. I guess at some point you could, like I understand if there's an American who argues that the U.S. had to do something in Afghanistan after 9/11, but Australia, wasn't the target of the 9/11 attacks, and so you kind of say they're fighting on behalf of either the UK or the US empire. I'm just wondering, like, what the justification is, because we're constantly propagandized with, you gotta like stop the terrorists. And just this week you had we had Representative Dan Crenshaw, he's the guy with an eye patch, um saying that, hey, we're going to go back to the pre 9/11 days, meaning that, hey, we're going to have a 9/11 if we leave Afghanistan. What kind of propaganda or what excuses does Australia use to get involved in this, war?
I think once again it goes back to history, because the Australian Federation in 1901 came about because of a lot of fears of China and Asia. So, I mean, where Australia is located, it's basically a European implant at the bottom of Asia. So there's a tremendous xenophobic history within Australian political masters when it comes to how threatened we are. We're a small population, huge landmass with a tremendous amount of resources, and there's always a fear, at least in the early days, a fear of like the Chinese and the Asian hordes, and then the Japanese when the rise of the Japanese Empire, and then on and on and on. And for example, Mark Sexton in his book War for the Asking used a lot of files that had fallen off the back of a truck. And in 1981, when that book was published about the Vietnam War, it was revealing, because The Australian narrative, for the most part, was that we were invited to fight the Vietnam War, when in fact the Australian government had pushed for the Americans to be very active in that war. And the reason is that Australia felt very insecure. The Australian government felt very insecure because the focus was on Europe. The focus was outside of Asia. So if the Americans were drawn into a conflict in Southeast Asia, that would mean that there's a lot of military forces here by the United States in Asia, and therefore there's a buffer that would protect Australia. So Australia's national defence is based on the premise that we will have a bigger friend. In the past, as the British Empire. Then after World War II, it became the American Empire. So in participating and being a coalition partner in these wars, whether it happens to be the Iraq War in the 1990s, to Afghanistan and Iraq War 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the 2000s and 2030s, it's basically Australia showing that it's a willing ally. But also, it's more complicated because Australia doesn't have an independent defence force that can fight for itself. So everything about it, right down to how we purchase our weapons, from the Abrams tanks to the F-35, it's all based on a cohesion with our bigger friends, the Americans, for example. So we need to function as a segment of the US military operations. And I think in that report by Braden Chapman, on the interview with Braden Chapman with Scott on the Scott Horton show, he mentions how the special forces had more contact with the American military than they did with their own national government's military. And I think that's telling that we are basically a proxy, a colonial force, if you will, to simplify it. And I think that's a big factor when it comes to why Australia is so eager to go in Malaya, to go into Borneo, to go into Vietnam, to go into Somalia and things like that. We can pretend that it has something to do with nation building, that it has something to do with securing the world, but we're not getting involved in Azerbaijan and Armenia. We're not getting involved in stuff that's happening in Latin America. We're very selective where we get involved with. And so we're not even getting involved with the Indonesian military conduct in Papua New Guinea. We're not getting involved in that. That's closer to us. So it's very self-serving when it comes to it. And not to go on a tangent here, but I think there's a bit of a danger to that policy because, for example, during World War II, where we had hinged our loyalties to the British Empire, a lot of Australians were fighting in military operations against the Germans in North Africa, the Mediterranean theatres, and a lot of Australian fighter pilots and pilots in general were operating in Britain. Then war was declared against Japan, and then suddenly we realised that there was a threat of a potential threat of Japanese invasion, and the cream of the crop of Australia's military forces were deployed fighting for the British Empire. The British government did not release those soldiers, and when they did, they reluctantly did, and they put them in Singapore, which is well north of Australia. Singapore fell, and a lot of elite Australian soldiers were captured. And then when we needed to defend Australia, that one time in history where Australia was actually under threat by the Japanese, where we fought where the Australian military fought in New Guinea, it was by the militia, by the reservists, what was called the chocolate soldiers, because the joke was that they would melt under contact. But these soldiers fought honorably, but the moral of the story is we hinged our bets doing all this imperial military deployments for the British, the Americans, or whatever. But when it comes to our own defense, will we have our forces back home to defend ourselves? Should that ever occur? And history has shown that in World War II that it was very dangerous, and fortunately the Americans came in and helped us out. And that's how our defense mentality works. So in short, it's because we are obedient to the empire, if that makes sense.
I mean, that's really just a kind of a crazy story about how imperialism and trying to play like the world chessboard, which is something that I'm increasingly worried about looking at the Biden administration, where you had like kind of just straight up belligerent hots in the Trump administration, like Bolton and Pompeo. You now have Anthony Bilkin and Michelle Flournoy coming in under the Biden administration. And these are people who think that, hey, we could tinker with this thing or that thing and do this and that. And, we're going to make the world a better place. And so, hell, it sounds like the UK almost caused Australia to fall during World War II. By taking away their, better forces, and, just thinking that you're able to play these kind of games on the global scale, and, that you're like, I just the amount of hubris you must have to think that you could position the pawns, around like this is crazy. So, your article really focuses on the culture in Australia. I would say if this were the US, I feel like it's pretty unlikely that anybody is going to go to jail for anything done during the terror wars. I mean, maybe we'll get like something where, something was so horrific, talking about like crimes against a child or something like that, like on a personal level, not like an airstrike, but like, you like sexual something. I don't want to go to, anyways. Unless something like that happens, I really don't think we'll see it. And in the fact, I'm looking at, you mentioned the Eddie Gallagher story, where, he ends up getting a presidential pardon. Looking back to the Vietnam War and My Lai, I think the only person who ever like faced any criminal punishment for that only ends up doing like 3 years of house arrest, not even like actual like jail time. And so I think it's pretty unlikely. In fact, Chelsea Manning ends up doing more work, time than any of the people for the crime she had exposed and ever like that. So, what is 2 years from now? Are any of these people in jail? Do you have any idea, like, kind of where the culture's at and like how you think that's gonna play out?
I can't honestly say because at the moment, the media, the mainstream media here is taking it pretty seriously, and I mean, the military is definitely taking it seriously. There's talks of, I think disbanding the SAS units involved, or even some people are saying that we should disband the SAS, which I don't think should happen, and I don't think will happen. But that's a bit like defunding the police. The attitude is that, oh, if we defund the police, we call it something else, and we integrate it into another department, or we turn it into something else, things are going to change. You can't change the fact that you're going to get a special elite force that's going to be the tip of the spear, and you're going to expect this very few amount of men to do all of the heavy lifting when it comes to Australian foreign policy overseas, whether that happens to be intercepting refugee boats, which it's done in the past, training foreign militaries, even some very nefarious ones, or fighting alongside the US and coalition partners in Afghanistan and Iraq. You, you're going to have a force as long as the Australian government is doing what it's doing overseas. It's going to have a military force that's going to do that, and it doesn't matter what you call it. Many of the current members are going to be transferred over to that, and the culture will just be shifting under a different name. Now, as for the people going to jail, I would say perhaps yes. How severe the punishment is, I don't know. I mean, and then this once again, it's not just Australia. There's a lot of Japanese war criminals that weren't hung and that didn't go to jail after the Second World War, and that's considered one of the most pariah empires in history, and they were brutally defeated. Same with a lot of the Nazi war criminals. So a lot of a lot of these criminals that were in defeated nations did not end up facing severe punishment for the deeds that they personally themselves committed. So I think there's going to be a push to punish maybe the 19 that are accused. There's going to be probably a look to see how much this affects the hierarchy of the officer class and the politicians. I mean, I've read some people that want to arrest John Howard and the Australian prime ministers, which is I'm not going to defend a politician, but I am, I guess. They weren't on the ground. They weren't cutting hands off. They weren't slitting boys' throats. They weren't torturing people, and they certainly did not, as far as I can tell, give any orders. So this is something that was at a small tactical level. These decisions were made because the way that these special forces operate is that they are very insular from the rest of the army and certainly from the Australian government as such. So a sergeant or a corporal might have made these decisions. But I'm pretty sure when you see some of the footage on the Killing Fields documentary that the Four Corners has run, you can just see that a lot of these decisions were made on the spot by the operators. They'll shoot someone, and while a soldier that witnesses that may disagree with it, they're unable to do anything. They're in the middle of another country. They're isolated. They're not going to get into a fight and have a very dramatic casualties of war Michael J. Fox scene with these guys. Instead, they're just going to say nothing and deal with the stress and the trauma later, and maybe be whistleblowers, 6 months, 7 months, 2 years, 5 years later. That's what I think is going to happen. And I think ultimately, when it comes to the Australian public, um, they're going to move on. Honestly, I think while this is a big thing right now, they're going to move on. And there's going to be the people that, whether they happen to be a libertarian or a communist, or they happen to be anti-war or a hippie or whatever, they're the ones that are going to remember it. They're the ones that are going to remind people of it. But ultimately, the Australian public will move on in 3 months' time. Many of them already have. They're just going to go, oh dear, those bad boys over there. That's what's going to happen. And there's a lot of people just as over there in the United States that are supporting the military regardless. Like we have Like I said, like the I stand with the SAS hashtags on Twitter, things like that. You know, you've got these people that will watch a movie like The American Sniper and they will get excited at the idea that, Chris Kyle exists. They'll read his book where he admits to doing some pretty bad things and they'll get excited by it. You've got that here. You're always going to get that. And I think at the end of the day, these guys may get punished and get jail time, but maybe in 5 or 6 years' time, some of them will get out and they'll be writing their memoirs. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It's hard to say.
I,
Maybe that's pessimistic.
I mean, I'll just, I mean, I guess, any kind of, if, as long as they go to jail, I mean, that at least is something, especially because there are whistleblowers in this case. And it's so hard to get whistleblowers to come out. And when justice isn't done, it's so discouraging. So if they do end up going to jail, then now that's something. Now, to put this into context, I mean, you brought up the Kunduz hospital attack, which was an international Doctors Without Borders hospital that was blown up to pieces by a U.S. gunship. Several children killed as the doctors fled. They shot the doctors. This was during the Obama administration, and they come out and they're like, "Oh, it was an accident." And then, "Oh, they were treating Taliban in there, which they were also treating Afghan government soldiers. These are just injured soldiers who have by international law right to care, and so that's not an excuse." And so then they go back to an accident. And a couple people get reprimanded, but nobody goes to jail, and so just it that happening, and then things like Chelsea Manning and John Kiriakou end up being the people who go to jail for exposing war crimes. Potentially Julian Assange, who we'll talk about a little bit more on the show. Hell, if somebody goes to jail, I feel like that's a little bit of a win. It's not the greatest victory, but so yeah, I mean, I think the Gallagher guy started his own brand and is slinging shirts and gear and stuff like that. So
I think the fact that the Australian military is, they're doing press talks, that the Australian government is admitting. I think that there's admissions that this is happening is already a small victory, if you will. It doesn't
mhm,
change the fact what the victims in. I mean, because let's look at it this way. Even in this whole inquiry, the Afghan civilians are still props. They are props of war. Their suffering is not really considered. We look at war as glory for other men. And that's all it comes down to. These guys are going over there, they're doing a tough task. I'm not disputing that. And when they go into a village and when they knock down doors and when they, execute a dog or kill their farm animals or, destroy their motorbikes and all this stuff, these are really important things to the community there. And these are really important things to the individual, but they're just disregarded because these are playthings in time of war. And I think the great tragedy of this is that the Afghan civilians are going to be statistics. It's just going to be another 39 lost in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions eventually, of dead individuals that have been humiliated, shamed, murdered, beaten, raped, bludgeoned to death, and then traumatized. And then these 19 soldiers that are accused, it's going to be meander down a rabbit hole of they've got PTSD. I don't dispute that it was the officers that had ordered them, that it was the war itself. They then somehow, through the majesty of nationalism and through the majesty of obedience to the state, they're considered victims in themselves. And that's the great tragedy of this, that the justice will probably never found. And the Afghan government will go, "Oh, yep, thank you for your apology, Mr. Prime Minister from Australia. Now we can say that we've done something for, the civilians." That's what's going to happen out of all this. I think it's just going to be one of those things that in time it's going to be forgotten. And the people that have suffered, the people that are that have been humiliated, if you will, they're going to be a little bit more loyal to the Taliban. They're going to be a little bit more loyal to the local warlords because every single foreign soldier that comes to their village, there may be 10 that are smiling, but the one that sticks out in their mind is the ones that shot their dog, that slit their child's throat, or the ones that are flying the jets or the drones that are blowing up the fruit pickers. That's what they remember. That's certainly what
mhm.
I'd remember. I mean, that's what we should remember. We should remember about war. That is the reality of war.
Yeah, absolutely. No, fantastic. And I guess I just want to wrap up this part by asking, With this, is there any like real push in Australia to get your troops out of these wars and just kind of be like, look, we're done with it. We don't want to get into this ugliness. And obviously, as you point out, it does. You know, you are traumatizing your own countrymen here.
Well, yeah, well, that's a crazy thing. Like, so these incidents that's come out in this Brereton report go back to 2007 and 2013. After that, officially, Australian military is only over there in a very limited capacity to train and to advise. And before that, the special forces operations like the SAS was not known to the public. The average Australian, even most people in the Australian government, were completely unaware of the details of their operations and what exactly that they were doing. The traditional role of the Special Air Service is as a reconnaissance and a long range and observation and things like that. At least that's what most people assume it to be. They're definitely an elite, but the door kicking down and the going in and torturing and all that—that's something that they're not supposed to be doing, I suppose, according to the cultural zeitgeist. As for wanting to get troops out, most Australians are completely unaware that there's any soldiers still over there. They know that we are participating, but the depth of the participation is unknown. And when it comes to traumatizing the soldiers, I mean, I think it's just gone over 500. There's over 500 Australian soldiers that have been abroad that have committed suicide, and they when they come back, and this is something that was going on in the news in 2019, so last year. Some of the accused were talking about how they don't get any treatment when they discharge and they've been on combat operations. The Australian government just, yep, no worries, cool, good luck, take care. Now, Australian, and this is going to just explain a bit of the background here. Australia at the moment is going through what's like a real push to acknowledge mental health, especially among men. So for the average civilian, they can get on all these schemes and benefits and all that if they're suffering from mental health, whether that happens to be real or imagined, from depression to anxiety, things like that. There's a massive push for that. If you are a normal Australian, a non-combatant, and you identify as having, autism, mental health of any type, anxiety or depression, you're going to get probably a few welfare benefits and things like that. If you're an Australian warfighter who's just come back from months, if not years, of being overseas and witnessing your peers or even yourself committing these atrocities, and not to mention just general war, having explosions go off near you, you pretty much get no help. You get no treatment. And this is the great tragedy of it all. This is the stupid thing of it all. Australians and the Australian government will do what they do in America. We will have our remembrance days. We'll stand up for the troops. We'll talk about how great they are and how heroic they are. But when it comes to actually looking after them after the fact, they are disregarded. They are disbanded like a used condom, and they are ignored completely. And that is what makes the bluster that people say to someone like myself or you or the journalists that are reporting on this, that we have to show respect to the troops or we have to do all this. In action, the Australian government and the Australian public are showing lip service. They are making it, they're virtue signaling at best. And when it comes to the actual treatment of these soldiers, they're completely ignored. One of the whistleblowers, as I mentioned before, Kevin Frost, he's dead. What all the dark horrors that he witnessed, the things that he was unable to see that his teammates had committed, they swallowed him up, and that took his life. That is the truth of the matter. And there's going to be a lot of broken individuals that have come back. Now, the flip side of that coin is how many hundreds of thousands of Afghanis, Iraqis, Yemenis, etc., are experiencing far worse. Every time they hear something above them, they look up, there's a drone. And they don't know if it's going to snatch their life away. They can't go to weddings. They can't go to, their children's birthday parties. They can't go to funerals. They're scared that they're going to go to a local marketplace, that an insurgent's going to blow it up, that a coalition soldier's going to gun them down, that a drone's going to snatch their life. Imagine the stress and strain that it does to children and adults when you have that. So while we talk about the PTSD of Australian soldiers and American soldiers, imagine the trauma and tragedy that other individuals across the world are feeling because of our government's foreign policy. Once again, like I said before, this is because they're treated as props. Because the Australian soldiers, the 500 Australian deaths, as horrible as that is, the ones that have committed suicide, which is a higher number than what Australian soldiers have died over there, just as well, they're considered martyrs, if you will. The Iraqis and the Afghanis and the Vietnamese 40 years ago, they're just considered as a statistical blip on someone else's history. And that is what is going to constantly occur every time we are going over there doing horrible things to them in the name of our own national self-interest.
Hmm. Yeah, no. Yeah, and just to expand, especially here in the U.S. on the troop point, the politicians really don't care about my. When I found out about the Agent Orange thing, that the that troops were still struggling to get recognition for the damage done to them by Agent Orange, like 20 or 30 years after the Vietnam War. I found out about this growing up. I was shocked. Everybody walked around. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. Oh, you're so brave. And then you have a multi-trillion-dollar budget and they can't find a few $1 million for these people. It was unbelievable.
Yeah.
I lived in New Hampshire and it was, I think, the only state that didn't have its own VA healthcare facility, so a healthcare facility for the veterans. And every year, or I'm not even every year, every month, we had a senator from the Republican Democrat Party, a governor for a couple years from the Democrat Party. Then she became the senator. Then we had a Republican governor. Anyways, all of them. Oh, we're gonna get a facility. We're gonna get a facility. We're gonna get a facility. Then they pass a $2-3 trillion budget. No facility. And they talk about, oh, you need to support me because I support the troops and support the troops, and obviously they don't actually care about it. But I did want to move on because you are in Australia. I thought it would be interesting just to ask you, what the COVID lockdowns are like there. There's been a couple interesting stories in the past week. The first one was this tweet that I absolutely loved. Well, actually, I despised it, but it sums up 2020 well. This lady tweets at her police department asking if it's okay to walk the dog because her husband thinks it's okay and she doesn't. And the police say no. And she's like, well, I'll tell him so. And then apparently, like, this was based on a misreporting or some kind of fraud, and that there was really no reason for the lockdown in the first place. So, kind of just take on the COVID thing generally wherever you want to go. What are the lockdowns like? How are the people reacting to them? Is it, kind of the compliance we see in this tweet where like people are narking on each other, or are people finally getting done with this stuff?
Um, so I'm in Adelaide in South Australia, and for the course of the year, it was pretty. We were pretty lucky. Like our state premier and state government wasn't exactly the most harshest compared to say in Melbourne, in Victoria across the border. But so the incident that you're talking about with the while we had the circuit breaker, the snap lockdown, the hard lockdown, is because an individual that was working at a pizza store just didn't tell the contact tracers the truth. And the reason why, he was doing cash in hand work for the employer, and that's really taboo in Australia because every Australian, not every, but a lot of Australians seem to think that we need a cradle to grave employment agreement. We need, we need, holiday pay. We need sick pay. We need all this sort of stuff. And they can't understand that people don't want to be on the books. All right. So this guy, probably a young guy, lied. He just said, look, oh yeah, I got a pizza delivered to me, and that's how I got COVID. It turns out he was working there 2 or 3 days a week, I believe. So what happened is the state was quite concerned that the virus could be spread from someone eating a pizza that's just been delivered. And so they overreacted, and there was a lot of criticism, I think, from other practitioners across the state borders, saying, "Oh, it can't be done that way." Doesn't matter. So they did a harsh lockdown, and it was very uncertain what you could and couldn't do. For example, there were massive lineups to go to the shops. There's massive lineups to go to the liquor store, the drive-through liquor stores. But then suddenly you couldn't exercise outside. You couldn't walk your dogs. You couldn't go to the beach for a walk isolated. You couldn't go to the park for a walk. Things like that. And it was very inconsistent as what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. So people were learning over the course of the lockdown. Turns out the guy lied to contact tracers, and then they're slowly easing the lockdown. For example, gyms now only allowed to do fitness training. So they're not, let's say I coach combat sports, so I'm not legally allowed to teach people how to wrestle because of physical contact or sparring and things like that. But I could before this lockdown, but now they're just easing things back. And it makes no sense why they're easing things back. I mean, obviously they're going to give you a whole heap of medical reasons that that they might make up on the spot or because certain advisors have given them. But the problem is there's an inconsistency. Now, when it comes to the narking and the dobbing in, there are a lot of people, especially on social media, that are definitely for the lockdowns. They think that this virus is going to be the worst thing ever, and that the government is within the bounds to do whatever it wants. If the government said that we have to live in massive incubation tanks and we'll force fed, you know, through a tube through our mouths, then I think a lot of people would probably be for that, given how concerned that they are for this virus and how determined that they are to quell it. Um, but there are a lot of people, they may not be in social media, but there's a lot of people who are very wary and are very tired of the status mentality to micromanage everyone's lives, to tell people what they need to do for their own health. And it's very hard to take serious someone who's, you know, maybe obese, smoking a cigarette, telling you what you can and can't do for your own health. And the other thing that I think is really disturbing is the hero worship of our politicians, whether it happens to be the Victorian Premier Dan Andrews or the Health Minister here in South Australia, Nicola. People are calling her a saint. They're making up religious idolatry and they're praising her because of her conduct. And it's like, it's pretty widespread. There's a lot of social media accounts, say on Instagram, for example, there's a lot of Adelaide ones, and it's a lot of it is dedicated to worshipping these people because of what they did. They did nothing. They did some presses, and the advisors advised them what to do, and then they part of a committee, no doubt, made a decision. What's scary about that is the hubris that this is going to engender within their mentality. You're going to have these premiers and these government officials that are going to feel that they have the absolute authority to decide what can and can't be done for individuals. And that is really scary. And there's a lot of people in this democracy of Australia that are supporting that. So it's, I mean, yeah, it's concerning. And the incident you're talking about, that is a micro incident of what scores of them. I mean, imagine being a cop, and imagine being, you know, someone going around, and you join the force to go after rapists, to go after murderers, to go after home invaders, and things like that. And you are going up to a child who's walking their dog, and you have to give their parents a $1,200 or whatever fine for that. I mean, imagine that. That kid is not making any contact with someone except for you. When you come to that when you create that situation to give them a fine, it's stupid. It is really stupid. I mean, I can go into details regarding a comic book convention I went to earlier in the early last month, where the organizers, and this is before this lockdown, this is also just for COVID observation, the organizers were told, consistently that they're only allowed to have so many people in at a certain time. They're only allowed to have so many stalls in at a certain time. And then even then, when the police officers came through, mind you, unmasked, ungloved, they would come up to the COVID marshals. We have these things called COVID marshals now that businesses have to have. And the event organizer, this far away, talking to them, telling him that people are not socially distancing and that he will face a fine and potential prosecution. Now, think about the irony of this. For some reason, people think that a police officer or a public official doesn't contract or spread this virus. I mean, one of my friends was staying in quarantine with me because he'd just come back from Qatar. When the police officers arrived, they were unmasked, ungloved. They shook his hand. They spoke within a few feet, less than a meter away, so a couple of feet from him, talking to him about stuff. And he was supposed to be in quarantine, and they were supposed to make sure that he was observing quarantine. Now, I know that when the cameras are rolling, that these police officers will be 10 meters away, that they'll be masked and gloved and all that. But the reality is the average person, and I'm sure the average government official, doesn't take it that seriously, because you can see it with their actions.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone took things super seriously, you wouldn't be on the streets. I wouldn't be going out. If this is the virus is definitely a legitimate thing. It's definitely real. It definitely does hurt and kill people. But the average person doesn't think it is as serious as what we were told it was back in February and April.
Right.
And
I
I
mean,
think that
you could have a distinction between Ebola and COVID without being a conspiracy kook. And people really pretend like you can. Like, if you're not like, this is going to kill everybody over 70, or you think that it's, we have to lock down because if somebody dies of this, it's the worst thing that's ever happened. You're just labeled a kook. And it's like, no, I could have a nuanced view where, like, I acknowledge that people are dying from the virus, but also, realize there's other consequences and everything like that. Yeah, and as far as the elected officials not taking it seriously, I mean, we have a couple of the great California Democrats here. Nancy Pelosi attended a beauty salon indoors when they were closed, and then didn't even say I'm sorry about not wearing a mask, but blamed the beauty parlor for setting her up. And Gavin Newsom, the California governor, went to a dinner with, like, this is one of those places where you're gonna pay $300 for a plate of pasta. I don't know how that's possible, but this is one of those kind of places. He went to a dinner at one of those places without a mask. It's unbelievable. And then he lots down California, and so obviously these people aren't serious about it. But before we wrap, last question. I'm just curious about Assange. That he is an Australia citizen. That's where he's from. And, I feel like if there was an American journalist who did some reporting on another country and then that country tried to scoop him up from a third country and throw him in jail, we might be a little upset about that. Not that this is exclusive. I don't know if we would have been that upset if the Bolsonaro government in Cuba imprisoned Glenn Greenwald or something like that. But certainly if like Russia or Maduro in Venezuela or Iran did it, I could see people throwing a fit and like this invoking like some feeling of nationalism and everything like that. So is there any like solidarity for Julian Assange? Is there any thoughts that, boy, the Americans are really overstepping on this one or anything like that?
I mean, I can't speak for 20 plus million Australians, but generally speaking, there are people that do want him free. They have from day one, and they are advocates on social media and journalists and things. Chris Pilger, an Australian journalist, he's really John Pilger, sorry, he's very very vocal about that. The average Australian, I don't know many that I come across that even want to talk about it. I mean, for example, like I mentioned before, when we're talking about the Afghan files in 2019, Australian journalists had their houses raided and they were arrested for a 2017 article on war crimes. Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights. We have no real freedom of speech. We have really convoluted libel laws here and things like that, which is why I have to constantly say alleged and things like that. So when someone's accused of something, it's really hard to go down that path. But when it comes to Julian Assange, I honestly think that most people still think of him as a alleged rapist, and that he is someone who has helped the enemies of democracy, if you will, the United States and Australia, and has put mud on their face. He's destroyed the institutions of government. Um, Australians, generally speaking, do like their government. The whole bushranger mentality that Australians celebrate is not here. They do love it and they do trust it. They may despise partisanship of the different parties, but ultimately they have a lot of faith and belief and they're dependent on those institutions. So when someone like Julian Assange comes along and reveals the undergarments are dirty, then a lot of people do get a little bit upset about that. And I think that the Australian government has been quite mute about it. A former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, to his credit, has written an open letter asking for Assange to be released and things like that, but it's gone no further than that. Um, I think that is the problem. I think most people, I mean, perfect example out of the whole, everything we've discussed right now, it'll be my conversation with you regarding the lockdowns and the COVID policies. That'll probably draw the ire from most Australians. They will completely ignore the injustice that's occurred for the Iraqi civilians, Afghani civilians, and Julian Assange, and they'll be more concerned with the the ability of the Australian governments, the state and territory governments, to do what they need to do to protect Australians from a virus. When it comes to revelations that governments, foreign and even Australian, have done horrible things, the Afghan files, Afghan papers, WikiLeaks cables, they're not going to read them. They won't, for the most part, care. And I think Julian Assange is someone who's completely been removed from most people's awareness. And unless you constantly hit them on the heads about it, they're not interested. He's not an Australian citizen as far as they're concerned. And the wider repercussions of his trial, and if he does get extradited to the United States and probably goes into a horrible prison sentence and in a hellish situation, most of the journalists who themselves could potentially face that aren't even reporting on it. So it's scary. So in short, I don't think many people are taking it very seriously here when they should.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. This was great, and keep writing stuff for the institute, and I will have you back on the show to talk about it. Tell
Awesome. Thank
people where they could find your work and where support you, or anything you want to plug. Um, Before we wrap here.
I have a page, halfcage.com. Or you can follow me on Twitter if you want, Kym Robinson 80. And yeah, if I'm writing for any war, I'm sorry, for Libertarian Institute, then yeah, you'll find my stuff there. So thank you very much for that, Carl. It's a pleasure to speak to you
Yeah, it was great to talk to you. Thanks.
anytime.